I heard it restated recently that basically all politics and political conflict boils down to history, to differences of how you narrate history and contested narratives of history. And I think that's very relevant to the panels, the papers we have on the panel this afternoon, which I will introduce now, and then we'll go in sequence as it appears in your program. First, we'll hear from Thomas Krackattu, India-China border dispute, followed by Yuan Zhang, who will present on the comparative studies of primary marks and secondary marks of the Buddha. And then thirdly, discussing the strange and the fantastic will be Barnali Chanda. And I liked Jian Ying's example this morning, not to waste time with biographies because they're all in the program. So after that, we'll have our discussants present, including one of whom unfortunately is presenting in absentia, and I'll read his remarks. So we'll begin now with Joe. 15 minutes, Joe, and you know where to look for the timer. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the India-China Institute for giving me this opportunity to present my recent and most current research on India-China boundary making, shaping of material reality in the late 19th and 20th century. Bad history reified within political systems has directly impinged on the prospects of peace between India and China, and without much academic overreach, it can be argued that there is no clearer understanding on the boundary today as there was during the time that the two countries went to war. The India-China boundary is usually trifurcated into three segments, and I'll just try and I cannot zoom in here, but if you could, the boxed segment is the western sector, covering proximate areas of the Ladakh region of Jammu and Kashmir and Tibet. The northern segment within that boxed area, which is technically now Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, adjoins Xinjiang. The middle sector comprises areas proximate between Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh and Tibet. And the eastern sector comprises the proximate areas of Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet. The theoretical point of departure for my paper is the constructivist paradigmatic optic that it employs to discern how the creation of knowledge, beliefs, and norms in each country's decision-making process evolved over time to actually alter the meaning and construction of the material reality of the boundary itself. Such perception relating to the boundary, my paper posits, does not overlap with the actual historical evidence that emerges from either side on the same issue, but which each country nonetheless tends to reproduce in pursuance of a socially constructed reality, which is best exemplified in the claims of my traditional customary boundary on each side. What my paper tries to do is to look at whether there are discernible internal inconsistencies in the representation of what each country claims as my traditional, my customary boundary, and was the boundary making process in the western and eastern sector delinked from each other. India's claim in the western sector evolved out of Britain's attempts to define and delimit a boundary with China. The Indian position has been that the entire Ladakh area, which includes the contested Aksai Chin area, became part of the Jammu and Kashmir state as a result of a treaty signed in 1842 between the Maharaja Gulab Singh on one side and Lama Guru Sahib of Lhasa and the representative of the Emperor of China. The British commissioned several surveys. Now, Britain took over Jammu and Kashmir in 1846, and they relied, even unto this day, on the 1842 agreement, which was basically a peace agreement. It was never accompanied by any map. It was never accompanied by any delimitation of places. So in furtherance of this, the British commissioned several surveys in the second half of the 19th century to discern the limits of Kashmir. The interesting part was that the Chinese were never part of these surveys. One of the earliest authenticated delimitations of the frontiers of Kashmir appears in the photozincographed sections of the part of Kashmir, Ladakh, and Baltistan, showing the boundary of the Maharaja of Kashmir. I'll just bring to your attention the most proximate areas to China, section 19 and section 20, just to give you a sense of where India's boundary claims unto this day have emerged from. Section 19 would give you a sense of the Indian boundary touching the 80-degree east. Now, I don't have a pointer. I could have just pointed to you the light line, which shows the 80-degree east 30-minute line longitude up until where, according to this map in 1868, the Indian boundary extended. And section 20, which was right below it, it does not reach as far as the 80-degree east longitude line. In the context of the great game between Russia and Britain, the government was aware of the kind of natural barrier that the Karakoram ranges provided. And before I move on to a discussion on the orography of the area, I just want to bring to your attention that even though this map, again an original from the archives, shows the limits of the Indian boundary at the 80-degree 30-minute east longitude, if you examine other sources, such as the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh, it's very insightful. 1875, much later, Frederick Drew, Maharaja's governor of Ladakh, cited in the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh, from the Kunlun Mountains southwards to the head of the Changchengmo Valley, the boundary between Ladakh and Tibet is quite doubtful. In the neighborhood of the Pangkong Lake, there have been boundary disputes, which may now said to be latent. From the Karakoram Pass eastwards, to pass the meridian of 80 degrees east, there has been no authoritative demarcation. And as such, the country is quite uninhabited for more than 100 miles in every direction. As far as the northwestern segment is concerned, the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh in 1890 notes, commissioners were sent to demarcate this boundary, but do not appear to have arrived at definite results. And same is the case for the eastern boundary. Now, what's interesting is that some of the explorers who are cited eventually in the making of the map by the Trigonometrical Society have been criticized. If you look at the vast literature, whether it is A.G. Nurani, whether it is Karunakar Gupta, Parshottam Mehra, all of them, they have varying accounts of how successful these explorers were. And many of them established that these explorers, they weren't really familiar with the orography of the area, given the understanding of geology at that time, given the access to those areas at that time. And probably in order to please the Maharaja, they probably felt that the Maharaja's reach extends till wherever he can see. So that was the understanding of actually making these initial boundaries. And then when you look at the Gazetteer of Kashmir and Ladakh, it becomes very clear that none of these areas were actually demarcated quite properly. Again, coming back to the discussion of the great game between Russia and Britain, the British government was aware of the natural barrier that the Karakoram range provided. And they were alert to the possibility of the Russians moving on into Xinjiang, the southwest portion, Kashgaria. And in order to avoid having Russian boundary co-terminus with Indian boundary, the alternatives they had was either to move the British frontier northwards, north of Karakoram, to include places like Shahidullah, but as examination of archival evidence points out, Francis Younghusband, who headed the Tibetan Frontier Commission, they were against this move because they felt it would be offensive to the Chinese, as it has been recorded. Or the other option was to make the Chinese assume efficient control over these territories, such as Raskam, Hunza, and the other areas between the two mountain ranges, the Karakoram and the Kunlun. Now, there are, of course, other readings which deal in greater detail with the tribes which were inhabiting these areas between the Karakoram and the Kunlun, but suffice it to say that the tribes in these areas were not subjects of India and China in the conventional sense. And though they had some kind of a dependency relationship with China, that ceased upon British intervention. So that was the status of some of these areas. And for all practical purposes, these areas were right at the periphery of the empire and were clearly outside the pale of administrative control for both. The idea, the policy drift therefore went that if Russia were to occupy Kashgaria, it would make sense to actually have this wedge of territory between Kunlun and Karakoram arranged as a neutral state. But for that, the British needed some sort of a treaty arrangement with China in order to problematize that particular stretch of land, so that eventually, if the Russians were to occupy Kashgaria, the status of this area would have been problematized already by virtue of some form of a treaty. This gave rise to a couple of solutions being prescribed. The Forward School advocated the Kunlun Range, the northern range, as India's boundary, and of course there was the other school exemplified by the McCartney-MacDonald line, which basically argued for a Karakoram alignment as far as the northern frontier was concerned. And Sir Claude MacDonald, the British minister in Peking, addressed a formal note to the Sungli Yamen, the Chinese Foreign Office, in March 1899. And this is the only official communication from the British government to the Chinese that exists unto this day, but which went without any accompanying map. So the places were marked, and just to give you a sense, the segment highlighted in bold to the left is what was the McCartney-MacDonald proposal. And the reason McCartney's name came in was Macartney was the British official in Kashgaria at that time, and he had access to another Chinese diplomat called Huang Tachin, who had a map which basically depicted Aksai Chin as part of Kashmir. So the British compromise was that we will retain a part of Aksai Chin, basically the Lingzi Thang Plains, as part of our boundary. And this was the last and only official communication from the British to the Chinese. Now, with the collapse, and this was 1899, with the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, and the fact that nearing 1911, there were several disturbances in Tibet, and of course, a lot of these surveys, they were actually carried out when Yaqub Beg was able to overthrow the Qing dynasty in Xinjiang, 1868 to 1877. That was the time the bulk of these surveys were carried out. What the British did is that with the weakening of the Qing Empire, particularly at the periphery of its control, the British modified the lines that they had originally proposed. Now, the original line was one that excluded Aksai Chin and included a part called the Lingzi Thang Plains. But the British, they modified the lines and suggested we go back to the Kunlun mountain range as the proposed boundary. Reason for that being, well, the Chinese did not officially ever correspond back or respond to our proposal, and therefore the British felt they were not held by it. What is interesting to note is that by 1912, there is a clear policy, and Henry McMahon, the foreign secretary then, he, who's usually associated with the eastern sector, the McMahon line, he was one of the first to articulate that, well, the Urda boundary, or the northern boundary, which shows the Kunlun alignment as India's northern boundary, would exactly suit our political interests. And to also quote the Viceroy's note to Whitehall then, in Chinese hands, this claim is harmless, but transferred to Russia, it will prove embarrassing. We should demand as a preliminary to negotiations a recognition of a boundary line which will place these areas outside Russian and within our territory, and a line similar to that proposed by Sir John Erda in 1897 will obtain this effort. So this is where the last of the British diplomatic position remained. What was the Chinese reaction to the assortment of lines which were proposed? Well, Zhou Enlai's letter to the leaders of Asian and African countries clarifies this. He argues that the British government, seeking a shortcut for invading the heart of Xinjiang, laid covetous eyes on the relatively flat Aksai Chin. They dispatched military intelligence agents to infiltrate into the area for unlawful surveys. In compliance with the will of British imperialism, these agents worked out an assortment of boundary lines for truncating Xinjiang. The British government did try at one time to alter, according to its own wishes, the traditional customary line. Notice that Zhou Enlai uses the phraseology of a traditional customary line. So did China have a traditional customary line? 3 minutes, okay. So basically, China's traditional customary line is the map attached by Zhou Enlai. And just to bring to your notice, from the Karakoram Pass at 78 degree east longitude, it dips, and India is co-terminus with Xinjiang and Tibet at the Konka Pass. This, according to Zhou Enlai, is the traditional customary boundary line. Again, my paper actually looks at how the so-called traditional customary line has been depicted by the Chinese in terms of official sources. And specimen A is the Shuchen Shechie Xiangtuai, the Atlas of the World, published in 1941. And here the northern limits of India adjoining China are specified by the Shifu Khela Kunlun Shan. This is not the Karakoram range, which is the Khela Hulu, loosely translated, and neither it is the Kunlun Shan, so referring probably to a spur of the Kunlun range meeting the Karakoram range. This map was approved by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Nechengpu, under what was then the Republic of China. Specimen B is one of the earliest maps published by the PRC, 1951. And the editorial note here interestingly clarifies that based on readers' feedback, the map was being updated, even though the editor cautions that at some places they were not sure of drawing the exact line, and whether to do that or not was also problematic. Now, it's interesting to note that India is coterminous with Xinjiang and Tibet at the Lanakla Pass. This is much further northeastwards than compared to the claim that Chou Enlai was making as far as the traditional customary boundary was concerned. Also, it's interesting to note the Pangkong Lake right here is split right at its narrowest as far as the traditional customary line, according to other Chinese sources, is concerned. And interestingly, the agency accrediting the maps was the Chungkuo Tushu Fashing Kungse. Again, it's the same agency which accredited the 1947 maps. Specimen C, this is the Chunghua Minkuo Shintitu, edited by Ting Wenqiang. Again, this was released in 1934 on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Shenpao, Shanghai News. Again here, just to bring to your attention, India is coterminous with Xinjiang and Tibet at Lanakla Pass. Specimen D, the New Atlas and Commercial Gazetteer of China, 1918. And it's interesting to note that the limits of Xinjiang are actually placed at the Kunlun Mountains, and where you see India coterminous is actually much further northeastwards. This is according to the Chinese. The Indian boundary was much further northeastwards, probably meeting the 80-degree east 30-minute longitude. That is what, according to them, was the traditional customary line at that time. Again, the next specimen is the China Postal Atlas, published by the Directorate General of Posts, Nanking, 1934. Again, Kashmir's boundaries are located between the 79-degree east and the 80-degree east longitude. Now, the point of discussing all of these Chinese sources, particularly cartographic evidence, is to show that the traditional customary line, according to the Chinese, was not an unambiguous, fixed traditional customary line, and it was clearly mutable from the early 20th century onwards. And the stress of my observation, unlike the other literature that deals with the India-China boundary dispute, and unlike what the other authors have dealt with, is that the vicinity of the Lanakla Pass has actually been shown by the Chinese. So even though the Chinese did not officially respond to the McCartney-MacDonald line, they did actually implement that alignment as their traditional customary boundary line. Again, if I were to quickly take you through the eastern segment, here as well, the great game playing out, fearing the Russians, had a possibility of entering Kashgaria. I'd probably take you through the Simla Conference, the fact that the Simla Conference was convened from November 1913 to July 1914. Basically, on a small-scale map of the Royal Geographic Society, the Tibetans and the Chinese were drawing lines, the British were drawing lines, and based on that, following 5 months of negotiation, a draft convention was initialed by the Tibetan, the British, and the Chinese plenipotentiary. Was China a reluctant participant in the conference? It was not. There is official record that the Chinese plenipotentiary was authorized to join in the discussion. Was the territorial limits of Tibet something that was to be discussed? Yes, there is official record that the territorial limits of Tibet were to be discussed at this particular conference. Again, due to shortage of time, I'll just bring to your attention the fact that after April 1914, the convention gets initialed. It's subsequently modified by the British, and these were the two. This was the Shimla Conference. Article 10, Article 11. In the case of differences between the governments of China and Tibet in regard to the questions, the aforementioned governments engaged to refer to the British government for equitable adjustment. And this was actually replaced, amended subsequent to the initialing of the convention. Basically, after a convention has been initialed by 3 parties, any subsequent amendment to it should reflect the alteration in consent, the original consent of the 3 parties. That never happened. The Shimla Convention, according to McMahon himself, possibly became invalidated as a result of this amendment. Some of the I'll just take you through the other developments, even as the
Okay, but
convention.
unfortunately, can I say that
Right.
during discussion, can we leave the PowerPoint up and you have a chance to return to it for a few minutes?
Right, I'm almost done. These were the two maps which were exchanged between the British and the Tibetan plenipotentiaries when the Chinese were not involved. McMahon himself records that the Chinese probably were not aware of all documents which were executed. Again, how were these areas, particularly in the eastern sector, depicted by other expeditionary travelers? There's Ferdinand Grenard, who shows that a bulk of these areas in the northeast were actually outside of Tibet, and they were actually color-coded separately from China, though technically they are shown outside the Indian Empire. And the Chinese did, in fact, implement a similar alignment to the McMahon line alignment in the New Atlas and Commercial Gazetteer published in 1918. Which shows basically Tawang as part of China then. I'll leave it at that. My ending points would be that Nehru had a reconciliatory attitude as far as these areas were concerned, but now both countries have moved on to a completely irreconcilable position as far as the claims are concerned. China claims the entire Arunachal Pradesh, India claims the entire Aksai Chin, though this was very different from the kind of historical evidence that emerges. And I'll end it here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Very, very rich paper with maps. I've seen a lot of talks on the boundary issue and a lot of maps, but those are really quite exciting to see, and I hope we'll have a chance to, you will all have a chance to see them as you reread the paper. Next is Yuan Zhang.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this great opportunity to have my paper presented and revealed. The title of my article is Comparative Study on Marks of the Buddha and Appearances of Chinese Mystical Animals. Based on the textual collation and cultural research of the Buddha's 32 Mahaprusha directions and 80 Anuvyandana directions in Larida Vistra. My argument is formed by 5 parts. And part 1 is introduction. Part 2 is an overview of the different editions of Larida Vistra. And part 3 is the textual collation of the 6 editions and the English translation. Part 4 is the comparative study. Part 5 is conclusion. So part 1 is introduction. And it's included the general idea, structure, the research method of this article. The methodological innovation of my article is to combine the way of philology and the way of culture study together, by means of which I'm trying to find the differences and similarities among the analogical cultural phenomena in order to figure out the intrinsic cultural characteristics between India and China before Buddhism had come to China. And part 2 is an overview of the critical editions of Sanskrit Larida Vistra and its Chinese translations. There are 3 Sanskrit editions and 3 Chinese translations. The Sanskrit editions is edited by Vaidya and Lefman and Midra. And the Chinese translations is translated by Dharmadaksha, Divagara, and Gyana Gupta. You can see it. Part 3 is the textual collation of the Buddha's marks in 3 Sanskrit editions and 3 Chinese translations of Larida Vistra, and the English translation is provided by me. And this is the philological part of my article. And after the careful textual collation of the Buddha's marks, we could see that there are 15 of the Buddha's 32 Mahaprusha directions and 11 of Buddha's 80 Anuvyandana directions that are related to the auspicious animals. These 15 Mahaprusha directions are related to auspicious animals. For example, the first one, the prince Savarta Sita has Ushnisha on his head, like the swine or some auspicious animals. Or like the 5th one, and eyelashes is like those of the bull. And 12th one, the tongue is long and thin, like the snake. 18 his arms are straightly hanging down while standing erectly, it's like the ape. And the 22nd one, The hair of the body is twisted upward to the right, like some auspicious animals. And 23rd, the genitals are hidden inside the bodies like the horse. And 26th, the fingers and toes are slender, like the ape or Indian crane or some auspicious animals. And 30th, there are webs between the fingers and toes, like a swan or some water bird. And 11, a Nubian interactionist. We could omit that. There are so many metaphorical sayings. So the fourth part of my presentation is the comparative study on the intrinsic differences and similarities of marks of the Buddha and appearances of Chinese saints and mystical animals in ancient times, with analysis of their cultural connotations. This is the part of the cultural study of my article, and also is the focus of my presentation. So according to the early Chinese materials, we could see Fuxi has the head like the bull, body and lips like the long, teeth like tortoise, and Nuwa, head of the human and body of the snake. Gao Tao, mouth like bird or horse. Shen Nong, head like bull, face like long, and Yu, nose like tiger, mouth like bird. Confucius, its lips like bull. And also phoenix, its upper part like the white goose, lower part like the killian, neck like the snake, tail like the fish, straight like a crane or forehead like the stork, cheek like the mandarin duck, lines of the body like the long, figure like the tortoise, beak like the swallow and the cog. And killian, its body like the river deer, tail like the bull, round head, one horn, and long, it has the head of the horse and tail of the snake. Its horns like deer, head like camel, eyes like ghost, neck like snake, belly like clam, scales like fish, claws like eagle, palms like tiger, ears like the bull, top of the head like the incense burner. The figure of long, phoenix, and killian, etc., are kind of common in the Chinese materials. There are a great number of unearthed archaeological discoveries of the recent years that have typical characteristics of the combination of auspicious animals and reflect the cultural combinations and interactions between the Yellow River culture and that of the North Eurasian steppes. For example, you can see this, the gold ornament with the standing mystical beast. This is from the Warring States period. It's unearthed from the Shanxi province. You can see the mystical animal. It has the bird head and a hooked beak. It's a hooked beak and a round eye, hoofed feet, is erect ear, and gorgeous horns with the eared hooked beak and bird head patterns here and on both of his horns, and with another hook beak bird head pattern on his tail. And his body and all four of his limbs is covered by the rolling cloud designs. So this is the combination of all the auspicious elements. Before Buddhism came to China, there was no concrete evidence on direct contact between India and China. These Chinese mystical animals that were created by a combination of different parts of real animals formed a parallel comparison between the textual description of the Buddha, with the textual description of the Buddha. And it could be seen from the above-mentioned materials that the Buddha is the same with Chinese saints, especially with the mystical animals, in the sense of being comprised by various auspicious animals and deliberately diluting the feature of common people. And the Buddha's mark could be described as the Buddha is bull-lashed and lion-bodied, snake-tongued and swan-crowned, ape-armed and horse-genital, deer-shanked and elephant-thighed or elephant-rolled, lion-cheeked and swan-handed or swan-footed, and crane-figured and peacock-haired. After this textual and cultural research of the 32 Mahapuruša and 80 Nubian directions of the Buddha, the conclusion could be drawn as follows. First, among the 3 editions of Sanskrit Ladita Visara, Vaidya's version is almost the same with that of the Lehman, and they are used in the same manuscript, while Midra's version is from a different manuscript or manuscripts. Great changes occurred during the transmission of Sanskrit Lalita Vistra, which could be seen through the differences between the Puyaojing that's translated in 308 and Fanguang that translated in 683. And second, the order of the Buddha's 32 Mahaprasha direction, 18 Anuvian directions, is recorded randomly with the main context fixed and the division between Mahaprasha direction and the Anuvian directions vague. Third, the mark of the Buddha reflects the combination of auspicious elements, especially that of auspicious animals, which is on the one hand similar to the depiction of some Chinese saints and god or goddesses as an imagination or metaphor, and on the other hand coordinate with the depiction of legendary mythical animals of ancient China. And fourth, the combination of auspicious animals in the Buddha symbol emphasizes the differences between marks of the Buddha and the appearances of common people, which symbolizes the supreme power of the Buddha and pervades the Buddha with a universality that surpasses culture, race, and nationality, which enables the Buddha and Buddhism to be more easily accepted by other civilizations. The comparative study between marks of the Buddha and descriptions of Chinese mythical animals reflects the intrinsic inclination of Asian cultures in both India and China, which is only a corner of the Indo-Chinese cultural traditions. There are still much more aspects of differences and similarities between India and China that wait for further explorations. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my paper is on discussing the strange and fantastic with special reference to the literary motifs in Indian and Chinese narrative traditions. The focus of my paper is I'm going to talk about defining the strange in Chinese and Indian literary traditions. Then I would touch upon a bit of history that facilitated such amalgamation, then the literary confluence, then social conditions, then identifying the motifs and their treatments in both these traditions. Then I would talk about the reader's response theory, which is an irresolute storyteller and his audience. Then obviously, as in all the strange tales, the problematic of fact and fantasy that I'm going to talk about. The definition of strange. So in Chinese literary tradition, the Chinese literary tradition, Confucius says, the study of strange doctrines is injurious indeed. The subjects on which the master did not talk were extraordinary things, fits of strength, disorder, and spiritual beings. In Confucian ideology-dominated Chinese literary tradition, there was hardly any space for supernatural accounts. The tales of supernatural grew as a subversive tradition. Strange tales were considered to be the history of the other world. But in Indian literary tradition, this was quite different. Indian literary tradition celebrated strangeness. In classical Sanskrit Alamkara Shastra, which is poetics, as its basis, the wonderful sentiment has astonishment as the dominant state. This is told by Bharata Muni in his text, The Rasa Theory. The Adbhuta Rasa is created by several determinants. Its essential excitant is held to be any supernatural strange event or creature. Again, the critic Vishwanath Kaviraj in his text Sahitya Darpana says, wonder is a kind of expanding of the mind. It is said that the life of all the rasas is wonder or adbhuta. So in Sahitya Darpana he says this, in flavor, even in every case, wonder is felt as its essence. Since wonder is its essence, it follows that flavor. Even in every case is that sentiment or flavor called marvelous. Hence the learned Narayana has acknowledged only one flavor, the marvelous, and no other. The post-Han Dynasty decline phenomena in China introduced the concept of transcendentalism. Buddhist concept of marvelous facilitated the growth of the narrative tradition. New thoughts from the translated Buddhist scriptures and exegetical writings emerged. The Adbhuta Dharma, or wondrous tales, freely drew narrative material from the folk tales and then restructured its natural and supernatural incidents and motifs. These ideas exposed the Chinese minds to the stories on supernatural, especially related to Buddhism. The Buddhist ideas gradually underwent a signification. It took some time and it was over hundreds of years, but then the process was very gradual. The Buddhist sutras that might have facilitated the growth of strange and fantastic tales tradition in both these countries, one of the sutra was Lotus Sutra. The core teaching of Lotus Sutra is the doctrine of universal liberation or salvation. In a strange tale, the space of supernaturalism reinforces the idea of liberation. The Lotus Sutra chapter 12 talks about the freedom to feel infinity in a little mustard seed. This sense of liberation can also be related to the supernaturalism, as it is the point where mundane becomes extraordinary, and it can happen anytime, anywhere, to anyone. The Lotus Sutta chapter 19 again says that anyone who is taught the Dharma Flower Sutra can embrace supernatural powers. These tales with elements of strange and adbhuta migrated via translation of Buddhist scriptures like Lotus Sutra, which contain the Adbhuta Dharma tales in it, and integrated the pre-existing indigenous concept of strange or marvelous. The sentiment of amazement or vismaya is created by the essence of wonder, or adbhuta, is produced in the audience who heard the tales. The readers or the audience gradually leave the ordinary behind and enters a realm of the imaginary world. They are amazed, surprised, and sometimes shaken after hearing such unexpected and supernatural accounts. The creation of wonderful sentiment, which is rasa, through a successful transmission of the stories, make the readers feel that they are in control over the miraculous power. The mortal world only works as a background for the entire drama. When we analyze these two traditions parallelly, then the social demands and the necessities which worked as a motivating force for the emergence and the popularization of the strange tales come in front. So I took up certain literary motifs from these stories and examined the survival and the continuous existence of certain common motifs and themes in the strange tales. Looking at them alongside will help to trace their origin, the evolution, and thematic changes in the story traditions. I have taken stories from Chinese Taiping Guangqi, which is written in 978 AD, and also I have used Sanskrit text Katha Sarit Sagar by Somdev Bhatta and Brihat Katha Manjari by Shemendra, written around 10th century AD. The rise of strange tales is a result of a political and ideological instability. These literary forms represent an escape from Confucian orthodoxy. Tales were written anonymously by the court literati and scholars while preparing for the imperial examinations. Strange stories are a mode of expression to escape the tedious course of passing the examination. In the stories, the protagonists are also scholar officials aspiring to become high-ranked government officials. The board scholars indulged in fantasy and experienced encounters with supernatural beings from the other world. In Indian classical narrative tradition, Somdeva, the author of Katha Sarit Sagar, was a court poet and the Kashmiri king Ananta. The grim history of King Ananta and his two sons was full of discontent, and this situation impelled Somdeva write these tales possibly around 1070 AD. He wrote the book for the amusement of the queen Suryamati. The composition was an effort to take the mind of the unhappy queen off the troubles and trials which incessantly beset her family. So escaping from mundane reality was one of the primary reasons behind all these strange tales. I have chosen two motifs basically in this paper: the motif of illusion and reality, or creating illusion in order to test the perseverance of a mortal, Wanqing and Chenxi, and also the motif of transformation, Pianhua. All these stories will be discussed by keeping the Buddhist motifs at the center. The illusion and reality motif we find in several stories in which the perseverance and the patience of the protagonist are tested by creating an illusory world. This is often conducted in order to succeed in a rationally impossible mission. Failure befalls because the magical fabrication is conditioned by temporality. The reader is amused and disappointed at the same time. So for the audience, I have prepared this table, and just to cut it short, it's like I have translated this Chinese stories from Taiping Guangqi, the story of Du Ji Chun, Hu Gong, Xiao Dong Xuan, and Wei Zi Tong. They all talk about an illusory world which is created in order to test the eligibility and the perseverance of the protagonists. The earliest extent of the story of Du Ji Chun can be found. The Chinese extent is Lie Shi Qi from Ta Thang Shi Yu Qi, the 7th chapter. But actually the Indian version is quite earlier. That is found in the Srimad Devi Bhagavata Purana by Vedavyasa. So the earliest Indian extent is this one. And the similar stories having the similar motif and themes are found in Indian stories also, from Katha Sarit Sagar, Brihat Katha Manjari, or Vetal Pancha Vinkshati. The story of Chandrasami and the Pashupat ascetic talks about the similar motif and similar themes, just with some Indian variations. The motif of transformation or Pianhua is one of the most recurrent motifs that connects the Indian and Chinese strange tale tradition through Buddhism. The Buddhist motif of retribution and reincarnation has found its supreme expression in this motif. The entire canon of Buddhist sutras contains this change or transformation motif. This kind of transformation in these tales can be reversible or irreversible, permanent or temporary. This is just like a phase of life. The motif of transformation is similar kind of a table I prepared, and I have translated stories from Haiping Kuangchi. Scroll number 286 depicts a story, Panqiao San Nyangchi. That story is has an Indian version also. In Katha Sarit Sagar, the story of Mriganka Datta from volume 6 tales talks about the similar kind of a story having the similar theme and motif. Similar kind of stories having this transformation motif can be found in Taiping Kuangchi, like stories from scroll number 426, 429, 432. And all these stories talk about the transformation of human into animals. One of the most celebrated stories is Li Cheng from the scroll number 427, which I will discuss a bit later. So all this motif in these themes, a superior creature gets transformed into a lesser being, supernatural creatures into human, and human into animals. But all these stories, this changes which happens in Indian or Chinese literary context, it's all conditioned by the cultural and civilizational difference. In Indian tradition, usually the essential excitant include the sight of heavenly creatures from another world and magical events like transformation. The Chinese story Li Cheng, which I would like to discuss a bit, having the transformation motif from the scroll number 427, portrays a proud and angry government official Li Cheng, who all of a sudden is transformed into a tiger. The strange incident inspired awe and fear in the audience's mind. A sudden and poignant change in tone occurs when the difference between the human world and the strange world of a transformed tiger having a human psyche comes up. When the tiger says, "How can I be remembered when I am turned into a strange kind?" This kind of a conscious psychological activity often is missing in the Indian tales. The compassionate Sahidaya audience feels amused by the creation of Adbhuta Rasa produced by the excitants or spectacles. They empathize with the sufferings of the other world, and for a short while they forget reality. These stories sometimes end with a deep pathos at the end, as the conflict between the human and the supernatural world becomes evident. In Chinese stories, the arousal of awe and fear in audience assure them that they are not a part of this mishap happened to the protagonist. The testimonial traits in the Chinese stories gives credibility to the accounts, and they continue believing that supernatural is hidden somewhere in ordinary and mundane only. So now we come to the problem of an irresolute storyteller. The strange tales make us feel the irresolute storyteller's internal contradiction between the maintenance of social decorum and the sympathy for the defiant self. The tales dealing with the supernatural entities and transformation basically pivot around the central problem of dichotomy between the self and the society. The quest for the inexplicable and the effort to overcome human limitations are stitched with the archetypal figure of the ascetic and the human. This is an effort to touch upon the world of the supernatural or immortals, Xian, by the mortals. This in a reverse way represents a conflict between the Confucian orthodoxy and the popular intention, the forced and the natural, the paradigms of canon and the fairy, the mainstream and the marginal. The Tang Dynasty author has created a world for the audience in which the fantastic and the real struggles to merge. But in the end, the author remains truthful to the social reality and leaves the audience in a deep melancholy. As in all strange tales, the problematic of fact and fantasy can never be ignored. In all these stories, the problematic of fact, in all these stories, this fictional discourse always represents the weaving of two worlds. One world is consisted of ordinary facts governed by the logic of human rationality and made familiar by historical discourse. The other world is something that transgresses the logical coherence of the first world and traverses the supernatural, extraordinary, and imaginary. Both these Chinese and Indian strange stories surpass these two worlds and actually create another third narrative world that mediates the contradictoriness of these two orders of reality within the restrictions of an essentially historiographical form. The psyche of the audience is well aware of the unbelievable qualities in the stories, and therefore he questions what he is experiencing constantly and stays surprised. The multiple divisions of self, the transformation of space and time, like in the story Dujichun and Hukong, are the literary tools that the narrator uses consciously to create an ambience of wonder and amusement. Neither time or space or not space is linear in the world of the fantastic. The Adbhuta Rasa that is incited by the narrator with the help of all these literary traits successfully produces a sentiment of Vismaya in the audience. As Jetlin truthfully said, if the strange can ever be defined, it must be defined in the changing zone between history and fiction, reality and illusion. Thank you.